Hi, quick introduction. I'm Sacha. I contribute to Lido research. I've been thinking about pre-cons since, well, based roll-up since November. I just want to set the stage a bit in terms of what like researchers within Lido seem to have consensus around. We are very worried about long-term centralization pressures of pre-cons. As such, we think inclusion pre-cons are worth experimenting with. But the execution pre-cons, we need a lot more research and deep thinking there, especially on actions we can take now that kind of have implications that are hard to unwind. So that on the execution pre-con side, we're thinking we want to move extremely slowly and do more deep research. The inclusion pre-con side, we see limited risk on that side, but still treating it as an experiment, something that should be opt-in only, and something that can be reversed if if there are centralization issues or things that end up detracting from Ethereum's neutrality. I think like going even further, I think we see that this only makes sense if it can increase Ethereum censorship resistance. So if there's some ability to also experiment with some sort of inclusion list around these things in a way that doesn't crowd out. I mean, in a sense, I think the pre-conf use case should not crowd out the inclusion list use case, and we need to think deeply about that. But this infrastructure can be extremely complementary, and my hope is it can lead to experimenting with inclusion list type designs that can then feed back into the research. Yeah, so like this is to give you an idea, we only want to like push or take steps that are absolutely non-coercive towards node operators, are aligned with Ethereum's endgame, and actually increase Ethereum censorship resistance. And yeah, with that, I'll let Francesco and Jonas talk about Chainbound.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Francesco, one of the co-founders here at Chainbound, and we're currently focusing on developing Bolt. Bolt is a protocol that's aiming to unlocking proposer commitments, and as Sacha said, starting from inclusion pre-confirmations. Yeah, we're going to just cover very quickly what is Bolt, why we're building Bolt, what are the components from a node operator perspective, and how does it work, and then also a quick roadmap that we planned. At a high level, Bolt is a protocol that will enable credible commitments from the proposer side. And the main aim of Bolt is to improve Ethereum UX and censorship resistance. Obviously, this is we're taking a phased approach here, and our first credible commitment in here is going to be inclusion pre-confirmation, which means a pre-confirmation on the inclusion of a given transaction, specifically useful for non-MEV transaction, as for example transfers, approvals, and around 80% of the transactions that are currently being sent to Ethereum every day. What is the ultimate aim from a node operator and validator perspective for Bolt is that it's aiming to increase the block space value, as the validators and the node operators are going to be able to do more with that. And there's a new sort of primitive for users to work with, and for users, dApps, applications, and so on. And ultimately, obviously, higher increased block value means potentially a higher yield. And yes, so in terms of like high level features that I think are important to touch on of this protocol is that it's obviously an out of protocol solution. It leverages restaking for economic assurance, meaning we don't introduce any external or new trusted entities, as for example a relay or so on, but rather we use economic assurances to prove the validity of a commitment that the proposer is doing. Most important, and also is compatible with PBS, meaning that there is no really opportunity cost on the yield generated from this that would be eaten by the PBS upside that's given by the sophistication of block producers. There are also a few design principles that I think are important to stress here. that divides into four main categories. One is trustless. There are no new trusted entities that are introduced in here. As we said before, it's credible and because it's proposer-centric, and meaning that we provide a delegated solution, meaning proposer can delegate to an external entity, and we're going to touch on it later, but we aim to give it a sort of complete agency to the proposer to what they aim to do. And it's permissionless, so any proposer can opt in, and as Sacha said, we are in an experimentation phase, so obviously we're happy to talk with any proposer, any node operator interested in this, but it's going to be fully permissionless, the opting in and out of this protocol. And finally, as we said before, it's compatible with the current pipelines of PBS and so on. Why Bolt is open source, and you can find it at on the repo in the Chainbound GitHub. And why we're doing it open source is because we as a company are focusing on speeding up the development of this new primitive that are proposer commitments, and in particular inclusion confirmation. And we believe that doing it in open source is by far the best way of doing it, and also utilizing the great support of this community. We're also doing open source because we're settling on standards. There is a lot to discuss. There is a lot of things that could be, I would say, pivotal to the development of this protocol. And we really appreciate people that provide discussion material onto the table. And Bolt has a whole section in the GitHub where you're going to see discussions that are open on specific topics, as for example, delegations and so on. And also because, as we said, yes, this will allow to collectively refine architecture and the trade-offs that we're making here. Speaking of trade-off, building a pre-confirmation and a commitment protocol, proposer commitment protocol, obviously has different trade-offs in its designs. We have this two-dimensional world in which we're looking at highly efficient or highly trustless setup. Right now, as Bolt, we are in a very, I would say, trustless setup, and a very trustless setup, which would mean fully proposer run actions with no delegations or like delegation from opted in for the proposer side, and proofs checks at every level of the stack. And we're going to touch on proofs later, but this is just a high level understanding of the trade-offs. But we could move on this in this bidimensional, I would say, area where there are different trade-offs that are made. And for example, there are other protocols which instead could opt in into something which is like proposer connected to just one relay. It's fully exclusive and relay run auction. It's not really the pathways we want to go, which is here, the yellow example, but it's something that again, such as this open design space would give to protocol engineers that are looking into this space. Where we want to be ideally over this months of development is on this axis, obviously. So have something that's highly trustless and highly efficient is obviously an ideal world, but we hope with the help of the community and also really understanding the different key stakeholders here, we can get there. What is the end goal? Here, I'll leave it to Jonas.
Right. So yeah, this table is split up into Ethereum today, Bolt V1, which is the current the next release, and then the Bolt endgame. So currently, if you're looking for an inclusion confirmation on your transaction, you have to wait 12 seconds. With Bolt, we wanna unlock faster confirmation times for these types of transactions, and that's something that Bolt V1 currently can give you. We also want to unlock credible proposer commitments, which are broader than just inclusion pre-confirmations. There are various other commitment types that we're experimenting with or are willing to experiment with, such as the ones listed below, partial block building, block space futures, and derivatives. Those are things that we think are very interesting to explore. We also want to provide better rollup support, be it based or otherwise. If you look at the current blob market, there are a lot of inefficiencies there. But if rollups can get better guarantees from proposers through proposer commitment or similar tools, they can get better settlement guarantees, faster inclusion. and stuff like that. So moving on to the next slide. I want to quickly touch on the components. So there's a couple of off-chain components and a single on-chain component that's very important to touch on. The Bolt RPC is the first one. It's essentially an RPC proxy server that propagates pre-confirmation requests or commitment requests to opted-in proposers in the look-ahead. This is what users interact with. And it is important to note that this component is trustless. It is a fully opted-in component that, if run by some sophisticated entity, will take care of security, denial of service attacks, and etc. But it is not a requirement to run Bolt. Then next up is the Bolt sidecar. It is the entry point to the off-chain Bolt infrastructure, and it implements the commitments API. The commitments API is how users request commitments from proposers, and the sidecar will turn these commitments into constraints. These constraints are necessary because, as you all know, a large amount of Ethereum block building is outsourced, and so there needs to be a way for the proposer to communicate constraints to the block builders to make sure that any commitments they made are in fact honored by the builder as well. For that purpose, we also have a modified MEV boost because the traditional MEV boost client does not support this functionality. And the functionality is implemented by the constraints API. Now, the constraints API, I'll touch on it later, but it's fully trustless. It verifies these constraints using proofs. So that's again one of the things that we're very adamant about, the trustlessness and not relying on external entities. Then moving on to the on-chain part, so we have the registry, which is a smart contract that keeps track of opted-in proposers and their associated stake. As Fra mentioned, we rely on economic assurances, be it from regular stake, restaking, or anything else that provides credibility to these commitments. On the right, you can see a quick diagram. The black boxes are what is currently unchanged, and the red boxes and arrows are what will be changed. So from a node operator perspective, the only thing that will be required to change is the addition of a Bolt sidecar, a modified MEV boost, but the core infra remains the same. The beacon node should only point their builder API to the sidecar instead of directly to MEV boost for this to work. So there are two interfaces. Between the user and the proposer, we have the commitments API, and between the proposer and the builder, we have the constraints API. The constraints API, to dive a bit deeper onto it, it requires some changes to the traditional builder API and relay APIs, but it will allow proposers to impose constraints on builders, where builders will then have to generate proofs of constraint validity. This allows this component can in fact be used in a standalone way to implement something like inclusion lists, where a proposer wants certain transactions to be included, and it will force the builder to do so. Next slide. So let's quickly run through a flow. So the user can send their pre-conf requests. We're talking about inclusion pre-confs here, to the Bolt RPC or directly to the proposer. In this scenario, we are using the Bolt RPC. The proposer will simulate and accept if the commitment is valid, the commitment, and it will sign it, making it binding. So it will then return a response to the user and forward these commitments as constraints to the relay. The relay will then store these constraints, again, forward them to the builder. And the builder is now tasked with building a payload. But not only that, now they also have to generate these proofs of constraint validity. So they submit their block with the proofs back to the relay. The relay can then validate the bid and verify the inclusion proofs. And then when the proposer finally has to propose, they call the header with proofs endpoint to get a block with the proofs. then they can validate the proofs and only then sign the header. And this is done in a fully trustless way. So the Bolt sidecar is, again, as mentioned, the most important part of the off-chain infrastructure. Some of its core functionalities are simulating these commitment requests to make sure that the proposer does not commit to anything that it cannot fulfill. So think about enough balance, a high enough nonce, and a high enough base fee. It will then sign these commitments with a binding key. And with a binding key, I just mean a key that has access to some collateral, so that this commitment can also be used as a slashing device in case any commitment was breached. It returns responses back to the user. And in the meanwhile, it will also build a local block template in the sidecar itself with the signed commitments. I should note that this is not a very resource-intensive process. It's just adding a list of transactions that you committed to, and yeah, just storing that temporarily. Again, it also turns these commitments into constraints and communicates them over the constraints API. And then also importantly, we added a local fallback block mechanism in case PBS fails to deliver a valid block. So you can imagine if you commit to making a commitment and PBS does not come up with any block that satisfies these commitments, we want to be able to provide a block locally that does support these commitments. So that's what the local fallback block building logic will enable. Then to quickly touch on delegation, Bolt can potentially run in delegated mode. It is not something that's supported right now, but we're actively looking and talking to a lot of people about this because from a sophistication standpoint, some of these commitments might introduce additional complexity, additional infrastructural problems, or just sophistication in general. And if proposers wish to do so, they should be able to delegate this. This is useful for proposers that have a trusted relationship with a sophisticated entity. But again, we want to highlight this is a trusted relationship. It is very hard to attribute faults in this relationship. And so we want to be very careful about this, but we want to provide the option. Okay. I can quickly go over commitment types. So why can't we just support all of these now? A couple of technical reasons. So commitment breaches must be provable on-chain for objective slashing. Objective slashing is something that we're, again, very adamant about because it requires no trust assumptions, no additional trust assumptions. And EIP 4788 allows us to do a lot of that. There's also some more meta reasons. So we call it the credibility upper bound, but essentially, you can only give a credible commitment with certain economic stake behind it. And so some of the commitments essentially fall above this stake that proposers can provide. So they're limited by the economic collateral behind them. Proposer sophistication, again, as mentioned in the previous slide, maybe delegation solves some of this. What are the trade-offs here? We're actively investigating all of this. And then high network participation, some of the commitment types, specifically ones related to execution, which are, again, as Sacha mentioned before, quite tricky and dangerous potentially, but they would also require high network participation, potentially adding to their risk of centralization. Okay, I'll move it to Francesco.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas. So a high-level idea of like the roadmap. Where are we now, and what are the next steps? Where are we now? We have a POC of Bolt, as we said, in the repo that you're gonna find it under Chainbound organization on GitHub, and we've been contributing to a few devnets that have been live. The first devnet was actually just run by us. Then we joined the Zoo Berlin devnet with a few other teams in the space, between validators, between validators, block builders, and relays. And then we also joined the Helder devnet, which was the HCC devnet, again, to showcase the functionality of Bolt. In terms of community and in terms of participation across the ecosystem, we're trying to collaborate with really anyone that can help us on the research side, on the development side, on the testing side, and on really driving demand and driving adoption, both on the supply side, meaning on the validator side, and on the demand side, meaning on building, moving wallets, moving applications, and new utilization of inclusion pre-confirmations. So to name a few, we applied to the Lido Alliance as a collaborative part on the supply side. We're working with 20 Squares. We're working with Shutter, with Commit Boost, Switchboard from Nethermind, with Spire and Symbiotic. I'm not going to mention the exact ways of how we're working with everyone, but mainly I would say majority is on the research side, meaning understanding really how, for example, a new commitment type would work, how the signing scheme would work for given node operators, and how different use cases of this would work. And finally, with the staking protocols, how we could make something that is agnostic, but it could also work with majority of the risk-taking solutions that are currently available. What are the next steps? The next steps is we are in, I would say, the core protocol development right now. We are working on the registry smart contract. We're working on the RPC, and we are finalizing the sidecar, which are, again, the core parts of Bolt. And also, we're going to have a few announcements soon. We're going to have the official Hello World of Bolt. Right now, we are on a soft release, but we're going to have a official announcement soon. And also, we are planning to go on Holesky in early September and potentially mainnet in early Q4. Again, these are tentative deadlines with many, as you all know, dependencies and things that still needs to be done. But again, I hope this gives clarity to all of you. Finally, a small call to action here. If you're a node operator interested in integrating, reach out for cohort 1, which is again our first cohort of node operator interested in joining. And we're also looking to build a workshop, to run a workshop for node operators interested in credible commitments, because we really need to understand the trade-offs here and how things work from a node operator side. So I'm actually gonna send it here, the link, so everyone can have access, I think. And this is just a form that whoever is interested is, will help us making the workshop come to life. Finally, we have a small demo, but I think we're out of time. So I think this was all, and thank you again for Lido DAO for giving us the opportunity to showcase Bolt and what it can really bring to Ethereum, and again, with the objective of bringing a new primitive, which are proposer commitment to life.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, both, for the really thorough presentation. We do have some time for Q&A. I don't see any questions in YouTube chat, but if any of the viewers, especially node operators, have any questions, definitely let us know. In the meantime, I think, apparently messages containing links aren't showing up in chat. Okay, so I'll have to log in with a moderator account to fix that. But we'll definitely add the survey link in the description to the YouTube video. In the meantime, I'll try to post it in chat. While I do that, Sacha, if you want to ask the guys any questions, and then I have one or two as well.
Yeah, I mean, one question I have, I guess, is I've heard you've been, well, I know you've been quite excited about pre-comps as a way of fixing inefficiencies in the blob market, and I'd be interested if you could double click on that. Like, how do you see pre-comps helping blob inclusion?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is actually one of the things that we're researching right now. So maybe, as some of you know, that there are some inefficiencies in the blob market. There are a couple of reasons for that, but one of them is essentially latency. So if builders want to include blobs, they have to pay an additional price in terms of latency, in the sense that blobs are very large. And so these builders are bidding in an auction where they want to update their bids very fast. And if they have to include blobs, it will slow down their bidding essentially and reduce their chances of winning an auction. So that's part of it. And so rational builders will try to minimize or not minimize, but they will sometimes try to avoid including blobs because it increases their chances of winning the auction. Because there are so few builders, this has very noticeable effects on blob inclusion. Some blobs sit in the mempool for tens of blocks while they do pay enough and should technically be included. That is one part of it. The other part of it is related to network latency. So this was PBS latency. Now we're talking about network latency. Blobs take quite a bit longer to propagate than regular blocks without blobs. So a blob is 128 kilobytes worth of data. You can potentially put 6 blobs in a single block. But obviously there is a deadline to when these blobs should be received by all of the validators on Ethereum, which is 4 seconds. That's when validators should make their attestations. If you include 6 blobs, there is that slightly higher chance that you might miss that deadline. And so for proposers, first of all, that's not great. Some proposers play timing games, which kind of exacerbates these effects. But on the other hand, this again makes builders not want to include too many blobs, because if their block gets reorged, they miss all of the block value that would be sent to them if the block were to be accepted to the canonical chain. And so one way you can potentially fix that is if you go directly to the proposer to request the inclusion of a blob, you can modify the PBS supply chain in a way where the builder does not have to constantly re-upload the blob and resend the blob to the proposers. And that would free up additional latency and potentially make the auction more efficient, while also making sure that blobs get included much more quickly. Because you essentially remove the decision from builders as to whether to include blobs or not. You move that decision to the proposer, which I think is one example of where proposer agency could be very, very beneficial for the network in general. Let me know if that answers your question. Willing to expand a bit more if you want.
Yeah, thank you. No, for me, that's very clear. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Sorry, I was hunting for the unmute button. I did have one question that I wanted to ask. So I saw in the slides you guys ran through earlier that eventually you want to work on like partial block building as a part of the protocol. Do you guys think that this is something really, really important in terms of like potentially reducing the current builder centralization issues that we see? And if so, how do you think it's going to accomplish that? Or is it kind of like, it might be something that helps a little bit, but won't necessarily offset builder centralization due to things like private order flow?
That's a good question. So the way I see it, there's a current problem with essentially the allocation, the monolithic allocation mechanism of building rights, in the sense that there's only one builder that can build the full block. Which means that if a builder, for example, is specialized in SEX-DEX arbitrage or top-of-block arbitrage, they might be less, they don't care as much for including anything else in the rest of their block, right? So there is a sort of differentiated block space between top-of-block and rest of block. And so I think a very interesting avenue of research is, what if you allow one builder to build the top of the block and another builder to build the rest of the block? Would that make more sense? Like, can each of these builders sophisticate or specialize in their own kind of avenue? I think it would open up the space for more competition, because you'll have sophistication on different parts of the block. And so, yeah, that's, I'm not sure yet, but I think it would help partly with builder centralization.
really interesting. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other questions right now, but we did succeed in finally getting the interest form posted in the YouTube chat. Apparently, if you're not like a channel admin, it doesn't let you post links. I guess that makes sense. If there's any more questions, we'll definitely throw them your way. We're anxious. I guess like the community node operators are definitely interested in figuring out what different kinds of ways that might be able to opt into pre-conf protocols first on testnet and then eventually on mainnet. So hopefully there will be more information and discussions about that stuff on the Lido forums in the coming weeks. And I think that wraps it up for today. The recordings and the segments will be made available as usual in the coming weeks. We hope that everybody enjoyed the show, and we'll be back next month for the next node operator community call. Thank you everyone for joining, and thanks a lot to Chainbound for presenting Bold.
Thank you.
Thank you.